Hi again. This is part 2 on Jaroslav Pelikan's Fools for Christ. His meditations upon Nietzsche. What did Nietzsche see that theologians of his day, most pastors of his day, did not see? Unfortunately, he saw that God was not the benign God of the Romantics, that is to be seen in the beauties of nature. He was there for sure, but that wasn't God. And was God a benign, welcoming old guy in the sky? The epitome of tolerance, the God of liberal theology right now in our 21st century. Well, Pelikan goes on this way. After such an existential realization of the power and awe of the holy, Nietzsche could not think of equating him with the gentle beauties of nature. The activity of God was much too furious for that. It was the sheerest romanticism, Nietzsche soon learned, to attempt to trap the holy in the beauties of nature. If there was a creativity of God in the universe, there was as certainly a destructivity of God. If we were to ascribe to God all the loveliness and tenderness in nature, sex, society, and art, we surely had to make him responsible for all the cruelty and pain and death that asserted themselves in these areas. If there was something in God that made the rose and the sunset, there was also something that made the cobra and the tornado. If God was beautiful, he was also ugly. If he was the principle of life, he also had to be the principle of death. Nietzsche's atheism sprang then from an awareness of the God against whom he had revolted. He knew that the holy was a force no man could control, that God was neither lovely nor congenial. God was not a kindly old man who gently nodded at the blunders of his children or grandchildren, and who could be appeased with a few childish presents. There was nothing beautiful or tender about the God who could and did forsake the crucified and plunge him into the damnation of being cut off from the divine life, that is Christ. The death of Christ he's contemplating. God was a consuming fire and a raging torrent. Whom but God did man meet in the hour of death, awaiting him not with comfort or kindness, but with holiness and judgment? Nietzsche's understanding of the holy was far more profound than some so-called Christian doctrines of God, for it broke completely with any identification of the holy and the categories of human value. Nietzsche's doctrine of man also helped him to overcome the equation of the holy and the beautiful. The essence of human nature Nietzsche saw in the will to power, of which all human strivings and values were merely expressions. Men wanted to have others believe that they were following a particular course for high and noble motives, but they were actually asserting a will to power. This will to power could easily use the beautiful as a shield for its demonic urgings. Precisely this happened when the beautiful was identified with the holy. Such an identification, stripped of all its pretensions, was an expression of the will to power and of the drive for control over the holy. Fundamentally, the will to power meant that man would stand for no challenge to his survival or nobility on the part of anything or anyone, not even God. Paradoxically, he would rather die than let anything stand in his way, and he would use every possible device to ward off the holy that sought his life. Nietzsche perceived in later years how demonic the identification of the holy and the beautiful could be. It could act as a mask for the will to power. With the disarming honesty that was at once his greatest strength and his greatest weakness, Nietzsche confessed to the will to power that had been at work in his advocacy of this identification. But it was too late for him to return. He had systematically brought down every prop upon which men build their lives. Morality had collapsed under his criticism, philosophy had crumbled, even art had deserted him. Robbed of all the resources for consolation and comfort that sustained other men in their age and weakness, obsessed with a holy that would not leave him and yet would not accept him, Nietzsche slipped away into the darkness and silence of insanity, where he died. Of the three values we have been discussing here, and by that he means the beautiful, the holy, and the good and true, The beautiful has been the most attractive, and the identification of the holy and the beautiful the most subtle. Sane men have found it difficult to go back on their intellectual training, even harder to reject their ethical inclinations, almost impossible to give up their dream of beauty. Like Helen in Goethe's Faust, it has risen up to inspire them and to fire their imagination. It took an insane man, lonely, embittered, and frustrated, to spurn even this last comfort. Nietzsche was insane enough to deny himself everything that might have made his life meaningful. This is what makes this madman a fool for Christ. Even though he, by the way, turned himself the Antichrist and the severest opponent of Christianity. He refused to be called a Christian. He took seriously the Christian assertion, however, that without Christ life was meaningless, and without God life was hopeless. He came to know that all the identifications of the holy with the true or the good and even the beautiful were narcotic self-deceptions by which men vainly tried to dull the horrible sense of loneliness and defeat that dogged their every step. Here was one man who was willing to see it through all the way, regardless of consequences. After casting aside other values, he was drawn to the beautiful as an explanation of the meaning of life. Yet eventually he left that behind too, and faced the nakedness of God alone. In this he stood in marked contrast to many Christians of that day and this, who have not let God interfere with any of their values, but have regarded him as the fulfillment of their fondest dreams and their tenderest longings. Truth did not point to God, he saw. Goodness did not lead to God either. Beauty did not speak of God, ultimately. All this Nietzsche realized during those 10 dark years when he lived in the madness of the holy. So I suppose Pelikan making him a fool for Christ is that Nietzsche, his explanation is that Nietzsche saw through all of the fallacies that make us want God for various reasons of our own. Nietzsche didn't want God, and he wasn't going to be fooled, even by his own inclinations and his own priorities. He was not going to be fooled into thinking that the belief in God, for most people anyway, was selfless. It was usually for most of us who believe it is a means to an end. As he saw, as Pelikan sums up in those last 2 paragraphs, the means, God becomes the means of realizing our dreams and our hopes. And God will never be that. So I suppose that is why I was initially surprised by finding Nietzsche in this company, but having read his explanation, I could see exactly his point, that Nietzsche saw far more clearly than most of us that God on our terms is not God at all. Jaroslav Pelikan, Fools for Christ.